They called him a former cop, a man who once wore the uniform of London's Metropolitan Police, once carried a sidearm and a pair of handcuffs, once swore an oath to uphold justice. But on a cold morning in Georgia, USA, that very man became a killer. The same hands that once arrested criminals now strangled the very wife he had married only 3 months after meeting on Tinder. They had rushed into marriage around 2022, and by one morning in late November 2023, that marriage ended in blood. That was Brian McManus, 57 years old, the man who only hours later would call 911 claiming that his wife had committed suicide. When Warner Robins police arrived at the scene, the truth looked nothing like the words Brian had just spoken over the phone. Lucille Ann McManus, 63, lay lifeless on the double bed, her body unclothed, her head soaked in blood. The room was deadly silent. No gun, no shell casing. A suicide scene? No. It looked exactly like a clumsily staged murder. And the most suspicious person from the very first moment was none other than the husband who once wore the police uniform. To understand why a marriage that seemed happy ended in blood, we need to look back at the story that began a few years earlier. Lucille was a calm, experienced woman. In her early 60s, she had been through life's ups and downs, and in her later years she lived alone. Loneliness pushed her to try to find love through the dating app Tinder. Among thousands of profiles she scrolled through, one face made her pause. A British man with confident eyes, describing himself as a retired London cop. The word police evoked a sense of safety, and the deep English voice during video calls softened her heart. That man was Brian McManus. He came to America with many ambitions, and marriage to Lucille opened a legal door for him, the green card. After only 3 months of dating, the two rushed into marriage. Lucille's friends were puzzled. Some advised her to be cautious, but she believed she had finally found a man she could rely on. At gatherings, she would even say with a smile, "He used to be a cop, I feel so safe." But the truth was not as beautiful as she imagined. Brian's past was filled with shadows. He had been forced out of the London police after allegations of inappropriate sexual behavior. He was not a hero, but a man who had abused the power in his hands. For Lucille, all of this was hidden. All she saw was a gentleman, someone who knew how to speak sweet words, making her believe her life had entered a new chapter. Not long after the wedding, the truth began to surface. Brian maintained a relationship with a woman in Florida. One day he mistakenly sent a romantic message, and Lucille read it. She was not only heartbroken, but furious. A fierce argument broke out, and in her anger, Lucille threatened. She would report to immigration authorities that the marriage was fake. If that happened, Brian's entire American dream would vanish. No green card, no chance to stay in the U.S., and even the affair would become meaningless. For a man used to control, that threat was like a noose tightening around his neck. On November 24, 2023, while many American families were still enjoying the holiday after Thanksgiving, tragedy struck. Brian called 911, reporting that his wife had committed suicide. He said he had returned from walking the dog to find Lucille dead. His voice was recorded, hurried but lacking sincerity. When officers arrived, they immediately realized the story didn't fit. No gun, no shell casing. A suicide scene? No. It looked exactly like a clumsily staged murder. And the most suspicious person, from the very first moment, was none other than the husband who once wore the police uniform. The autopsy by the Georgia Bureau of Investigation made it clear. Lucille had been struck multiple times in the head with a blunt object, the rubber mallet, and then strangled by hand until she died. Her skull was fractured. Blood pooled in her brain. Under Lucille's fingernails was Brian's DNA, and on his hands appeared fresh scratches, clear signs of a desperate struggle. There were no signs of forced entry, no property missing. But neighborhood security cameras recorded Brian leaving the house, heading toward a drainage ditch right after the crime. When police searched the area, they found a blood-stained rubber mallet and Lucille's phone, two pieces of evidence he had discarded. His actions afterwards revealed the staging even more. Before calling 911, Brian calmly walked the dog as if to create an alibi. Back home, he put clothes and shoes into the washing machine, cleaned the scene, and only when he thought it was safe did he call to report his wife's suicide. Brian's attitude throughout the investigation was chilling. He did not cry, did not tremble, did not show grief over his wife's death. Instead, he was only upset at being considered a suspect. To experienced investigators, this was the classic sign: a perpetrator caring more about himself than the victim. Not stopping there, Brian accused Lucille's niece and her boyfriend of being the killers, claiming they had conflicts with her. But cell phone location data showed that at the time of the murder, both were miles away. That absurd defense was quickly dismissed. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together into a clear picture. A man who once was a cop, forced out of the force for sexual misconduct, entered a hasty marriage to secure a green card. When threatened with exposure, he chose violence. And then came the clumsy suicide staging, so crude that anyone could see through it. The people of Warner Robins were shocked. They had never thought that someone who once wore the uniform, who once represented justice, could be the one to murder his own wife. They whispered in cafes, on the streets. If even a former cop can kill his wife, who can we trust? When police completed the case file, the trial loomed ahead. One haunting question remained. Faced with undeniable evidence, would Brian McManus confess or keep lying until the end? And what would the jury see? A grieving husband or a cold-blooded killer pretending to tremble in the dark?
In the cold room of the morgue, Lucille's body was placed on a stainless steel table. The bright fluorescent light shone down, reflecting off her pale skin. Forensic experts from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation began their work. Every injury on her body was meticulously recorded, from the scalp lacerations to the bruises around her neck. The report later confirmed Lucille died from blunt force trauma to the head, struck multiple times with a hard object, combined with manual strangulation. This result immediately erased the suicide story Brian had tried to create. How could someone beat their own head multiple times until their skull fractured? How could someone strangle themselves to death? That medical evidence was the first knife that pierced through the shell of lies. Examiners also discovered traces of blood under Lucille's fingernails, and the DNA matched Brian's exactly. She had fought back, clawing desperately. On Brian's hands, fresh scratches appeared, marks that could not be erased. These were direct biological proofs connecting the killer to the victim in her final moments. Meanwhile, investigators carefully searched the house. No sign of forced entry, no broken locks, no disturbed furniture. Valuables untouched. If this had been an outside attack, there would have been evidence of intrusion. But here, there was none. Police quickly understood the killer did not come from outside. The murderer was the very person living with Lucille. A crucial turning point came from a neighbor's security camera. In the video, Brian was seen near the drainage ditch shortly after Lucille's time of death. When police searched the area, they found a blood-stained rubber mallet and Lucille's cell phone, the murder weapon and a key piece of evidence, discarded in haste. That was the missing puzzle piece that locked the whole picture into place. At the house, they opened the washing machine. Inside, still wet, were Brian's freshly washed clothes and shoes. The smell of detergent lingered. To police, nothing was clearer. He had tried to wash away the blood, to erase the evidence. But instead of erasing, he left behind a clue even more obvious. When interrogated, Brian sat in a dim room, arms crossed over his chest. He repeated the story again and again. That morning he had walked the dog and upon returning found his wife dead. He emphasized that Lucille had mental health issues, that she had killed herself. But whenever investigators pressed for details, his answers contradicted themselves. Sometimes one way, sometimes another. Experienced detectives only needed to look into his eyes to know. This was a man fumbling through a clumsy act. One of the things that struck police most was not the lies, but the emotion, or rather, the lack of it. When speaking about Lucille, he was dry, almost unshaken, not a single tear. But when asked about being considered a suspect, his voice cracked, his eyes reddened. To prosecutors, that said it all. He did not grieve for his wife's death. He feared only for himself. Desperate to escape blame, Brian even fabricated another story. He accused Lucille's niece and her boyfriend of being the killers, claiming they had conflicts with her. But cell phone location data quickly disproved it. At the time of the murder, both were miles away. That absurd accusation only damaged his credibility further. As prosecutors pieced all the evidence together, they reconstructed the scenario of that fatal morning. Lucille had just stepped out of the bathroom, not yet dressed. Brian was waiting, rubber mallet in hand. He struck her head repeatedly, knocking her down. He then leaned over, using his hands to strangle her, ensuring she would not survive. Afterward, he walked the dog, tossed the weapon and her phone into the ditch, returned home to wash his clothes and shoes, and finally, when he thought the scene was clean enough, he dialed 911, inventing the story of a suicidal wife. That scenario might fool a stranger, but with forensics, with cameras, with electronic data, it was nothing more than a clumsy farce. Every detail he attempted left behind evidence, and when added together, that chain of proof became the noose tightening around his neck. But why did Brian choose that path? Why would a man who once was a police officer, who understood the law, risk murdering his wife? The answer lay in the months of conflict leading up to it. Marriage to Lucille gave him a green card, legal residency in the U.S. If Lucille reported it as a sham marriage, the entire application would collapse. He would be deported. On top of that, he had a mistress in Florida. That secret affair made him even more eager to break free from the marriage. When Lucille discovered it and threatened him, he felt everything about to crumble. And there was another factor: control. Once a cop, Brian was used to authority, to others following his lead. Being cornered by Lucille, an older woman, made him feel humiliated. For a man like him, losing control meant losing everything. That deadly triangle, immigration, infidelity, and threat, became the motive. It pushed him to the edge, and instead of choosing truth, Brian chose violence. When the case was published, people of Warner Robins were shaken. Newspapers printed Lucille's photo, a kind, gentle woman, beside Brian's mugshot in interrogation, cold face, lifeless eyes. Articles emphasized the sham marriage, the mistress in Florida, the desperate green card ambition. Lucille's family was devastated. At hearings, relatives broke down, saying she only wanted a simple love, but paid with her life. Their words brought many in the courtroom to tears. Prosecutors declared in court, this was not a sudden act. This was a premeditated murder, a desperate plan to protect his immigration status and his affair in Florida. McManus not only betrayed his oath as a police officer, he betrayed the woman who trusted him and gave him a second chance in life. The small town seemed haunted. People whispered in cafes, in grocery stores, if a former cop could do this to his wife, then who can we trust? A chilling sense of doubt spread everywhere. When the investigation file was complete, every piece of evidence pointed in one direction. There was no room left for doubt. The suicide story collapsed completely. And now, Brian McManus's fate rested in the hands of a jury in a trial that would last for days.
On the day of the trial, Brian McManus appeared in an orange prison jumpsuit, hands cuffed, walking slowly. His head hung low, his face gaunt, no longer the handsome man from the Tinder profile photo years earlier. The courtroom was packed. Lucille's family sat in the front row, eyes red. Reporters crowded the hallways. This was no longer just an ordinary case. It had become a story that outraged all of America. A foreign ex-police officer murdering his American wife to achieve immigration goals. The prosecutor stepped up to the podium, opening with forensic images that silenced the room. Lucille's body on the bed, blood soaking into the pillow, her head covered in injuries. The prosecutor stressed, this was not an accident. This was not a suicide. This was an intentional act of murder. Brian McManus struck his wife multiple times in the head with a rubber mallet. He strangled her until she no longer breathed. And then he staged a cheap play to deceive us. Next, the prosecution presented a chain of evidence. DNA under Lucille's fingernails, scratches on Brian, surveillance footage of him near the drainage ditch, the blood-stained rubber mallet, the hastily washed clothes and shoes in the machine. All of it was laid out like chess pieces on a legal board. Each piece of evidence was another hammer blow against Brian's defense. The defense attorney tried to fight back. They emphasized that no one directly witnessed Brian committing the act, attempting to plant doubt in the chain of evidence. But their arguments were weak because forensics had entirely ruled out suicide and no expert supported any alternative theory. The prosecution even played the 911 call. In it, Brian's voice sounded panicked but lacked grief. He repeated quickly as if reading from a script. The jury listened, and they did not hear a grieving husband. They heard a man trying to act a role. Lucille's family took turns testifying. Relatives told the court that Lucille had once feared if she dared to report the sham marriage, she might be in danger. Another broke down in tears, recalling Lucille's loneliness before meeting Brian. The courtroom sank into heavy silence. Throughout the trial, what angered the public most was Brian's demeanor. He sat calmly, showing almost no emotion, rarely turning to look at the victim's family. That coldness only made the jury colder. After days of arguments, when the prosecutor rose for the closing statement, the entire courtroom held its breath. The prosecutor emphasized that McManus had not only killed, but also betrayed trust, betrayed the chance Lucille had given him when she brought him into America. The jury withdrew. More than 4 hours later, they returned. The room fell silent. The court clerk stood and read the verdict. Guilty malice murder. Guilty felony murder. Guilty aggravated assault. Brian McManus dropped his head, his face pale. Lucille's family embraced, crying aloud. The prosecutor gave a slight nod. No one felt joy, because no verdict could bring Lucille back. but at least justice had named the right killer. The judge pronounced life imprisonment without parole. It meant Brian would die behind bars, never to see freedom again. A door closed forever. The media reported immediately. Major newspapers ran the headline, "Former British cop sentenced to life for killing American wife." Television stations broadcast the image of him being led out of court. The people of Warner Robins breathed a sigh of relief, but with a lingering chill. A man who once represented the law had now become a symbol of betrayal. This case left many legal lessons. First, it reminded everyone that marriages for immigration purposes are full of risks. When love is not real, conflict can quickly turn to tragedy. Second, it showed the power of forensic science. No lie can withstand DNA, cameras, and location data. Third, it exposed a harsh truth. Even those who once held power, even police officers, can become the most dangerous criminals. For Lucille's family, the pain remains, but they believe that by speaking out, by pursuing justice to the end, they did the last thing they could for her, not allowing her death to be covered up, not allowing the truth to be distorted. In prison, Brian McManus will live out long days without light within cold gray walls. A former police officer, a man once sworn to uphold justice, now a permanent prisoner. That image is a bitter paradox, but also the clearest proof of the fairness of the law. And when night falls on Warner Robins, people return to their daily lives. But somewhere, in collective memory, lingers the haunting of that Thanksgiving morning, the day an innocent woman was murdered by the very husband she trusted. That story will forever serve as a reminder. Truth may be hidden for a time, but in the end, justice will always find its way. What do you think about this case? A former police officer, a man once representing justice, became the one who murdered his own wife for a green card and a mistress. Was the life sentence enough to ease the pain of the victim's family, or is justice never truly complete? Leave your thoughts below, and don't forget to share so more people can know about this shocking story. If you're interested in more true crime cases like this, hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. Every subscription from you is the motivation for me to keep bringing detailed and truthful analysis.